Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings and salutations. My name is Tristan Watty, and I'm joined today by the mysterious, the serene, the legend in security, Jen. So, thank you for joining us today as we do the applauds and the claps and all of that good stuff. So, today is an interesting day. It's an exciting day in the security world, I would say, because for those who are keen eye of the viewer variety, you might have noticed something is a little bit different. That is because we're on groundbreaking floor territory. I'm talking about the first episode of a show combo that has been long awaited, long thought about. It's similar to mac and cheese, ice cream and sprinkles, peanut butter on hamburgers. And that, I would say, is the safe room featuring security side quests. And I do the round of applause and the cheers and all of that good stuff there before, because this comes from speaking about, caring about, and practicing security, because both shows cater to a wide range of viewers in colleges, the IT professional realm, business leaders, and beyond. So we thought, what if we fuse together like that episode of Dragon Ball Z around the concept of security? And that is how we got here today. So I would say, welcome, viewers. Welcome, everybody. And thank you for joining us today. So today, to kick this momentous occasion off, is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about generative AI, but we like to add some twists in there. We like to add some turns. We like to introduce from the perspective of a little bit of a mix of, let's say, gaming, a little bit of security, and a little bit of AWS security best practices. So I would ask Jen, are you ready to begin this journey today?
Ready?
You ready?
Yeah.
So am I. So what were we going to begin with? With asking the audience, where's everybody from? This is the question of the day. All right. So feel free to put it in the chat. Where are you dialing in from? Where are you listening from? Where are you viewing from? And then we will go from there. So as we continue to get those answers in the chat, what we'll do is introduce today's topic. We'll introduce where we're going today. And if you don't want to say where you're dialing in from, what we'll also ask is, what is your favorite breakfast food? Put that in the chat. That's a key item, right, of what we need to know today, especially since we're around the brunch time in the East Coast. And I pose this question to Jen. What is your favorite breakfast food to kick off?
I wouldn't say my favorite, but due to recent health conditions, I've maybe this is too much information to divulge, but I've recently been diagnosed with high cholesterol. So I've been told I can't eat eggs anymore for breakfast, stay away from eggs. So I'm moving more toward like oats, maybe adding a little blueberries here and there if I'm feeling adventurous. But yeah, just the basics, very simple breakfast. Yeah, can't add too many sweets and fatty foods in there. So
yeah,
it is.
So I don't eat eggs in the morning at all. So I can give you some tips there.
Oh, please.
Overnight oats, oatmeal, all of that good stuff. But I think my go-to, besides coffee, right? We moved that. That's coffee is a little bit too overpowered, right? So we can't say that. My go-to is a waffle with peanut butter. Simple, right? But effective with the protein. And as we start to dial in, we have a bunch of viewers tuning in from New York. Alejandro, welcome in. From Thomas, we have Frank from DC. All of these people saying hi and hello. Welcome in to the first episode. Thank you for joining us here today. So let us continue on with the main header, the main topic outside of food, which I know is important. But what we are going to focus on today is the title of this episode is Welcome to Summoner's Rift. As always, 10 billion points to you for those, however, who need a little bit more context. The inspiration of today's episode stems from League of Legends. And the main game map is the same name of the show, right? Little thing. A summoner is the name of a player who's controlling all the champions or pieces from afar. And we thought that this would be a perfect title to correlate today's topic. Because in today's show, we'll focus mainly around 4 areas. And those areas are going to be within the data protection realm. So we're going to understand some of the core AI data protection principles. We're going to implement basic security controls for AI workloads, monitor and audit AI data access, and creating a sustainable AI security framework, just to name a couple of items. If that being said, what I'll do is I'll throw it over you to Jen to kind of delve in and talk about some of the landscape from an AI perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get there, I do want to throw up a poll here. Who in the audience here has implemented any AI data protection controls in your environment? So answer 1 if you have, and 2 for not yet, but potentially maybe in the future.
Yeah. And feel free. This is not getting logged at all, right? This is just for us to understand kind of where you are in your AI data protection journey. I know a lot of individuals, a lot of customers are just getting to the point where they're trying to understand, how does AI fit within my environment? And now they're starting to leverage it. And now the next set of questions is, okay, we have to increase data protection and the different controls. And we also have to pan. What is our side quest today? Our side quest is right here, AI data protection. And
Yeah.
we have a couple of people answering too. So
2.
not yet. We're
Okay.
getting them in the chat. So
There's 1.
this is,
Yes.
we got a 1. Yes. 10 points. So as you go, it's perfectly fine, because that's what we're here to set up today. Is we're here to help understand where everybody is coming from. So now that we know, there's a lot of 2s in the chat. Jen, over to you to see some of the foundational standpoints of where to go to next.
Absolutely. So here, what I'm showing is a generative AI security scoping matrix. We'll definitely add that link in there in the chat for you guys to reference. So this is a blog post that was published about, I want to say, like about a year or 2 ago. But this is definitely something that I always reference, when talking about generative AI, just to get a good understanding as to where your generative AI application may fall, right? So we have like essentially a spectrum of I guess where you would maybe apply more controls, and then maybe if your application is a managed service, maybe that's less controls, right? So if we're talking an extreme scope 5, you have self-trained models, you are exclusively using something like Amazon SageMaker. There's a lot of architecture design that you have to think about. There's a lot of controls, a lot of things that you have to think about when architecting for a generative AI application under the scope. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have scope 1, right? So some examples that you have here on the screen are ChatGPT and Midjourney, right? And then everything that falls in between, right? Whether you're using Bedrock, you're using Amazon Code Whisper, any of those applications that fall in between this scoping matrix is kind of how you will define, what governance and compliance, what legal and privacy implications your application will have, risk management, and what controls, and then kind of how to also architect for resiliency, right? So the scoping matrix is, I think, super beneficial. And if you read more into this blog, it goes into all of those specific areas: the governance and compliance, legal and privacy, risk management, controls, and resilience. And it based on where your application falls, whether scope 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, kind of gives you examples, right, as to what controls can be put in place. So this is definitely a resource that I always reference. Sometimes when speaking to customers, they have all these different use cases, right? So I think it's good to always level set and say, okay, where in the spectrum, does does your generative AI application fall? And then, from there is okay, how you determine what data and privacy controls, what model security you'll need, what data protection controls, and then infrastructure security type of controls that you'll have to put in place. And then, later on, we'll talk about, more specific controls that can be put in place, like using Bedrock guardrails, using Macy, monitoring is super important. What type of logging is enabled by default? What is disabled by default? And all these things, that is super important to understand, to protect our generative AI applications, right? And a lot of these security controls are kind of go back to the basics, right? IAM, data protection, all of that, right? It's just in a different newer landscape, and understanding just the little nuances there. But yeah, that's kind of an overview of the AI data protection in the landscape, and definitely the generative AI security scoping matrix is a great baseline to start off of, and kind of building your security program around that.
Yeah, and you touched upon a couple of different points that are very important. This is just another lens of looking at the baseline controls, right? When you think of securing your AWS environment, what you really have to look at is, how is my overall security posture? And what this scoping matrix does is put everything in the scope of starting at, where are we looking at first? Are we looking at the consumer apps, the enterprise apps, and so on and so forth? So you can determine what models are you using, what do you want to leverage from an AI perspective, and it helps to tailor each piece of your environment accordingly, and then adding additional controls in. And one of the centerpieces that we're kind of hinting at here is that data protection side. Is, where is all the data coming from? Where is all the data stored? Those are all very important questions, all important pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to solve overall, right?
Absolutely.
So I think what we can do when we're talking about this is, what are some of the common challenges if we continue down that route? And I think the common challenges is, one, just understanding where somebody fits in within the generative AI scoping matrix. I know you mentioned the different conversation with your customers. What else do you see from a customer standpoint that maybe they haven't yet realized themselves, but they're still continuing to work towards?
I would definitely say, it kind of goes back to the basics, as something that I was mentioning earlier, that a lot of times customers don't realize that a lot of these security controls that have been used, like if they've been an AWS customer, if they are deciding to use generative AI applications now, it's like applying those same 101 foundational level security controls to those applications is definitely something that just something that you just need to remind customers. And just I would say understanding the vocabulary, the especially privacy like implications, things like that. I think that those things are definitely something that is more of an education piece for the customer, on educating them on that. But then when you kind of go back to like, okay, what kind of controls are we going to put in place? It's like I mentioned, going back to the basics, right? So just kind of reminding them that, yeah, this may seem scary and something completely new, but have no fear, we're here to help. And a lot of times when you kind of break things down, especially to something like this, like a scoping matrix, it's just easier to digest and to better understand.
Exactly. And then that's also part of one of my catchphrases, is breaking things down to the ones and zeros. So if
Yeah.
you take that and work backwards from it, it's taking each one of those steps, like you mentioned, which is very important, right? And language, that's the other thing, is making sure that you kind of know the verbiage. Even if you didn't know any of the technical standpoints, knowing what the words mean is very important. I often try to read a little bit more so I understand those different components for that reason, right?
Right.
So all good points. And I think with that being said, what we can do is get into a little bit of a quest because we outlined a couple of different things. And we had a title, we had the theme of the episode. So, for those who know what's coming next, that means we have a side quest. And when you think of a side quest, what you want to think about is a motto we hold near and dear, and that is security by 1,000 commits. What do I mean by that? Well, security by 1,000 commits means taking small steps or side quests, which will help contribute to your overall security posture. The reason why side quests are important is because a side quest can be anything. The context of the show can be a deep dive, a reading, coding, browsing, Q&A, but it can also be a customer story, an origin story, or a legend. So with that being said, let us set up a side quest really quickly. And we put this on screen. We add a side quest board and we jump into a side quest. So now I have to change my voice a little bit because as side quest legend has it, one person, one individual who is tasked, and we'll say it's a cloud practitioner. They were relatively new to the AWS cloud. They were trying to figure out how exactly do I secure my cloud infrastructure? Because this individual, let's say, worked for a financial services company. We'll set that background, that context. And they got to a point where, hey, my tickets are low. I think I went through the sprint backlog, all my story points, all of that is good. But just then, somebody jumped up and said, hey, there's something called generative AI. Can you take a look at it? Can you, let's say, implement it into our environment? And that individual said, sure, we'll do. We'll get right on that. And we all know that feeling. We're still learning, and we thought we got to a place where, hey, I know my environment, I know my security posture, but trying to define the next steps is very important. So what is the challenge? Well, I'm tasked with securing and implementing the Gen AI solution. I'm also tasked with saying hello and steak and eggs. Sorry to break it, but I had to come back. So I digress. So tasked with securing and implementing a Gen AI solution. So what we need to do is figure out, we have this challenge of, hey, how do I think about generative AI? And this is often a customer story or a place that an individual like you has been, placed in. So what we have to do is break it down to the ones and zeros. So we have the challenge. So within this scenario, you have a cloud practitioner who is trying to figure out their route. And that's where the SideQuest board comes in, because there's plenty of challenges. Let's say from a financial services standpoint, there's the data complexity. Financial data is often complex. There's also a lot of it. So you're talking about large data sets, which can increase the attack surface and make it harder to track and protect all of the data points. And there's integration challenges because financial, let's say, models, there's multiple sources, there's increase in complexity, there's multiple integrations, everything is connected, there's APIs everywhere. So ensuring consistent security across a variety of data sources and formatting is challenging. And the sophistication of the attacks are just increasing. So with that being said, if we lay out our SideQuest board with that in mind, we understand the challenges from that standpoint. We also understand that, hey, we have to start to think about the centerpiece is we have data. we have EFS, we have S3, and then we have our AWS environment. So what do we do to protect this if we go into our SideQuest? And that comes from these various services. We have identity, we have Macy, we have firewall manager, or I would say WAF. So if we continue on this thought path, let's see if I am an individual that is starting, let's say, I'll bring the individual a little bit closer. They have a little bit of knowledge, they have a little bit of environment. So they are here. So what we can do in order to connect these different pieces, and I should really just draw a little stick figure, but for today, what we'll do is consider this the starting point of where we're coming from. So what are the steps? We talked about 4 specific areas that we wanted to start to solve for our challenges. Well, encryption is a big step. So then we look at our different mechanisms. We look at how we protect it. So maybe something like KMS. It's an important part. Encryption at rest, encryption in transit. So centrally managing encryption keys, integrating AWS services for automatic encryption, using customer managed keys for the granular access. That's a key component. And encryption applies across a variety of different places, especially on the S3 bucket. We would like to encrypt those. That's one of the steps. So what we'll do, hey, we'll put this over here as a critical item. And what we're doing essentially is we're starting to build, let's say, a little path. So if I'm just starting out and I started encryption, okay, I am on track. I'm on my path to continue on the SideQuest. Because as legend has it, this individual is still trying to figure out which direction they should go, which way I should go if I don't know anything, right? That's kind of the thing when it comes to generative AI. But there's services and paths that you can take. So maybe another path that we can look at is, all right, I have encryption. What happens if there's sensitive data? Then maybe we leverage something like Amazon Macy. And what can Macy do? It can search for those sensitive data types. It's part of that layered defense that we speak about. We start to think about everything in a certain way, right? And what I mean by that is Macy automatically discovers and protects sensitive data in S3. So we're trying to get to here. All right, so we got that in place. So we continue along our route. We're making a roundabout circle because is security always straightforward? I would say yes and also no at the same time. I heard it both ways if you get that joke. So if we continue along the lines, what's another very important piece? Do we want to get to this? Wait, let's talk about something like guard duty, where we're able to take a look at what's happening within the environment because I have sensitive data. What happens if something happens to that data? Is something getting triggered? Is something being noticed? And just to quickly pause the SideQuest to go to the chat, will there be a VOD? Yes, there will be a VOD on your respective platform of choice, like YouTube. And how can we secure our AWS environment? Can you make it clear with example by doing it practically? Yeah. So there's a bunch of examples in here. So from a data protection side, these are some of the services: encryption and Macy and guard duty, all pieces of that practical approach. And thank you for that question. So as we continue on our story, we start to think about, okay, I have a couple different pieces of the puzzle. So, hey, I have guard duty, I have this, but is something missing in this approach? Because we were talking about the different areas. We were talking about how exactly we can protect with something like Macy. We can do some monitoring, which is a big piece. We could do encryption. But there's one piece that I want to say is very important, and that is the identity piece. Because that identity piece, least privilege, and I'll say it to the other side, least privilege is a very important part of the puzzle piece, right? So now we'll also move EFS over here. There's a variety of different services, but if we map out our path, we went from our stakeholder over here going to encryption, going to Macy, guard duty, and then IAM. The order of these can be argued, right? Take a look at the well architected and the security reference architecture, all those different components. But the main piece is right here is our data and data protection and the different layers. Leveraging all these approaches is a very important part of the puzzle. And this is a brief side quest that we can go on, that we can look at. And can we dwell here? I would say no, we cannot, because what do we have to do? We kind of have to hit the timeout, the pause game button, because we have to jump out every once in a while, because we start from working backwards, but let's work up from the high level and kind of bring it back down to the everyday life. And when we hit that pause game button, what do we start to talk about? We start to think of different mechanisms, different frameworks like the OWASP top 10 and things of that nature when it comes to specific Gen AI items, right? Prompt injection, that's a big important part. So with that being said, why don't we jump out and start to talk about some more of those practical pieces of the puzzle, Jen?
Absolutely. Let me make sure that this screen looks all right for you all. So here what I have displayed on the screen is a page from the Security Reference Architecture, also known as SRA. If you all are not familiar with SRA, it's definitely super useful guidance, I believe, for everyone, even if you're not even delving in with generative AI applications. It's essentially building blocks of how to securely build your environment, right? So a lot of customers, are customers that eventually grow out, have multiple accounts. So the multi-account strategy, thinking about how are you going to position your security services, controls. So essentially, this is literally all out of the box for you to just go and kind of plug and play, if you will. You essentially go in and decide whether you want to use X specific security service, and kind of how you want it enabled and configured. So it's just a really good baseline to have. I think this is a great starting point for any customers, no matter where you are in your cloud journey. And specifically, the security reference architecture, they have a integrating a traditional cloud workload with Amazon Bedrock. They also have a lot of other Gen AI specific architectures that you can see, but this essentially lays out the art of the possible, right? So you have your different OUs. This is specifically just kind of focusing on what a generative AI specific OU would look like, and what security services you'd have in place, and kind of the art of the possible, essentially.
Yeah, the baselines, right? That's you want to implement throughout your environment, and it's kind of starting from that standpoint of how do I lay out my environment to start off with. The security
Exactly.
reference architecture has multiple components inside of it, right? As you were mentioning. And there's a specific component for generative AI as well within that. But what you really want to do is break those things down, right?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
how would we go about that? If I were to task you with that, Jen, say, hey, I'm that individual from our SideQuest story. How would I break these things down to the ones and zeros?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So first you start with entry to your generative AI application, right? How is your application being accessed? So you have various entry points, right? You have whether it's your EC2 instance, your application load balancers, balancing all that information, and then kind of how you're going to render that information, right, through CloudFront and things of that nature. And then you have your kind of your ancillary AWS security services, right? You have the Security Hub, you have GuardDuty, Config, and Macie. One of the things that Tristan definitely doubled down on, talking about data protection, right? And then the basics, again, going back to the basics, we have AWS CloudTrail. So that's kind of laying out, like, I guess kind of at a higher level, right? If you scroll down a little bit more, like, let's say you're using Bedrock, right? That is definitely something that is a newer service, if you will, for a lot of our customers, right? So a typical web application firewall will not protect against like prompt injection threats, because these threats are in the form of natural language text. Firewall match code in places where it's unexpected, to help protect against prompt injection attacks and ensure like model safety, you would use something like Bedrock guardrails, right? That's something that will help you setting up the configurations and defining topics to deny, providing filters to handle harmful and sensitive content. Then we'd go into logging, right? Logging and monitoring. That's super important. One nuance I would say, outside of using CloudTrail, CloudWatch to log and monitor. For example, for Bedrock, if you want to see like the input data that's coming in, to your model, and the output data, you need invocation models enabled, right? That's not enabled by default. So that's definitely something that, as a security best practice, is something that we would, depending on, your use cases, it's definitely a business use case if that's something you want to enable, but that's definitely something, as a security best practice that I definitely do recommend there. And then, we have Macie, right? We have, we were talking about data protection. So Macie is designed to help organizations discover, classify, and protect sensitive data stored in Amazon S3. So by categorically having that data, is this PII data? Is this financial data? Is this intellectual property? Understanding the data that you have is super important, especially when it comes to generative AI, because if you're using this data to train your models, or in any capacity throughout your generative AI application, definitely something that you'd want to use there. Those are just some guardrails and some services there. Go ahead, Tristan. Sorry, I interrupted.
No worries. You were cooking, as they would say, with that, right? So it's very important parts that you hit, because when you start to think about it, right, from everything you were just saying, is the data. Some of the items and stories and the things that we're hearing when it comes to generative AI is like, what information is it pulling in? And that's where something like the OWASP top 10 comes in, right? When you think of like the training data poisoning from that aspect. So introducing bias or introducing sensitive data, as you mentioned, those are all very good points, because, hey, let's just feed it all the information. But it starts at the basics. What's your data classification types? How are you tagging data? What buckets are you pulling in? Do you just pulling everything? And that's something that is often heard, right? When you're thinking about the standards of what makes up a good security posture, when we think of that defense in depth. And even the prompt injection point you brought up was really good from a standpoint of, hey, maybe we have to sanitize some of the inputs. Maybe we have to harden some of the prompts. There's some default guardrails that we can enable, but we also have to customize a little bit based on our organizational needs. Because maybe you don't want everybody having, let's say, the financial services prompts, right? Think of somebody in HR versus somebody else within IT versus some other worker in the field. They might ask the same question, but are there guardrails in place to help protect against from getting a little bit too much information? And I think those are those little pieces of information where we say it a couple of times. I say it 3 times just for good choice, and that's least privilege comes into play.
Yeah.
So all important parts of the puzzle, I would say.
Yeah.
So I think what we also can ask from that perspective is based on what we just said, let's see if the viewers are paying attention. So a verbal poll, implementing AI data protection is a complete infrastructure overhaul. Put in the chat, true, false, yes, no, maybe in between that. I would like to hear everybody's responses to that. And we also have a question. Is this about building security pipelines for Gen AI applications? I'm sorry, it just came in. Well, thank you, one, for coming in. And two, maybe. No. And when it comes to building security pipelines, what do you start at the beginning of the pipeline? You start by understanding the different components that go into the pipeline. And that's where we're starting for today's adventure within the safe room is, hey, what is it, the data components? And then we start to move down the line of how we can talk about security pipeline. But today's conversation is mainly focused on AI data protection. So that hopefully that made a long story a little bit less long. So continuing on, feel free to put that in the chat. But I think another part that we need to consider and we start to think about is Jen brought up good points about leveraging Macy, leveraging IAM, CloudWatch for monitoring and alerting, and then encryption. And it's also in the SideQuest story, as legend has it. So the next thing that we can start to talk about, we can start to think about is what are the next steps? We talked about the security matrix. We talked about all these different words, concepts, things, thoughts, everything in between that. But I think what we need to do is start to continue along the path of just understanding. And that understanding path, where do we start? Well, we start at level 1, right? Because this is still a game scenario. So let's say you are level adventurer. We're still keeping with the welcome to Summoner's Rift standpoint. So you're a venturer. You're beginning off. You want to venture off and find out all about generative AI and the security components that go into it. So what do we need to start off? Well, I would say there's a couple of components to that. I think first we need to know a little bit of information. So we need to have kind of a knowledge quest. We need to bring in the Summoner's Codex. So what I would say, Jen, where do we go when we need a little bit of information? I would say somewhere in the AWS realm. Could be simple. What are your initial thoughts? I'll throw it to you really quick. See what happens.
Where would I
So
go?
if we starting out trying to figure out information, where would I start? And I will give you a hint. There's the aws.amazon.com piece of that. So the documentation.
Yeah, for sure. That's number one, I would say.
Yeah. When I don't know anything, I go to the document. What does the documentation say? And then
Yeah.
kind of move on from there. So I guess one of the first parts or pieces of documentation that we can go into, if we're just going generative AI route, hey, we can go to, let's say, generative AI documentation. All right, this is something I just pulled up. 3 key pillars for robust generative AI security strategy. Some place to start, right? So let's see what it says. Build a comprehensive generative AI strategy, innovate securely. All right, me as a person, let's say we're this individual that doesn't know anything. All right, this seems like a place I would stumble upon, right? In terms of documentation and the different partners and developing a strategy and the different tools, but maybe I need a little bit more. And we touched upon this And let's see, if we go here, if my links work, over here to, it's a weird symbol. There we go. To that reference architecture again. And we start to speak about the prescriptive guidance side of the house. I think this would be a part that, we would delve into. And look, it's all those things that Jen was covering right here. So this is an important resource link, right? As me, a level one adventurer, going out, trying to understand what is happening in the world, and also starting to jump in, right? Documentation, right? And we go to the chat and we have AWS Skill Builder, AWS documentation will help. Yeah, AWS documentation. So a couple different places, right? So as we continue on that route, and I am that level one adventurer going through, and the one thing I would note in this is the services. If I didn't know anything, I would start with, okay, this page, and then do I know what identity is? Do I know what S3 block public access is? VPC network analyzer, all these different components. Just figuring out. Remember, we're going back to the words, not even the technical yet. What do these words mean when we say reachability? What are we trying to reach? And starting to go from there. And that's one of the first steps that I would do as a new adventurer. And this is
Mhm.
all within the prescriptive guidance is all out there, right? So, uh, so this first step done, I think one of the other pieces is just figuring out, hey, how exactly do I go about kind of going down the path of understanding? Mm, I would say if we're talking about generative AI, there's a bunch of tools and guidance and workshops and things of that nature that we can use. I think one of the places, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jen, kind of one of the places to start is to take a self assessment of one, security knowledge, and two, kind of what is the current state of my AWS environment. I think that's
Absolutely.
important, right? 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 Because we kind of have to know where to start. So, like, kind of like doing a security assessment.
Yep.
Um, have you conducted security assessments? You probably have in your
Yeah.
vast tenure of your legends.
Definitely have. And I feel like there's a lot of different flavors and ways you can do it, right? Depending on where the customer is in their cloud journey. Um, we've done engagements where we've looked at each specific domain, if you will, right? IAM, data protection, infrastructure security, and kind of identifying, okay, which areas, maybe they're a little bit more mature in, and which areas maybe there's some areas of improvement. And kind of creating a backlog from there and prioritizing based on business needs. And then going back to the security reference architecture, I think aside from there being specific guidance about generative AI, it goes back to the basics, right? It goes back onto how to properly manage a multi-account environment. How to set up your environment, how to set up SCPs, how to set up OUs, based on various workloads. So again, just don't want to be long-winded here, but there's just a plethora of ways of kind of how to go about it, right? If you're looking at it, just specifically with the generative AI lens, right? Maybe doing a threat modeling exercise, for your generative AI application that you're thinking about, right? I think that's something that should definitely start at the beginning,
Yep.
of your journey of creating your generative AI application. But yeah, so many different ways, right? Threat modeling, just doing an overall assessment, the well architecture framework as well is a good baseline. So yes, it's just a plethora of things to base off of and say, oh, okay, like this is an area that we haven't touched on too much, and maybe we should prioritize that for this upcoming quarter.
Yeah, exactly. And I would also ask the chat the same question. Have you performed a security assessment for AI workloads
Yeah,
specifically yet? Right. I think that's a good question to ask the chat.
absolutely.
I'm kind of curious from that perspective of uh, who is the individual who is tasked with that, right? But as we start to get those answers, I think a couple of more places we can go just for that knowledge standpoint. Let me share out my screen really quick, because one of the important parts of being that IT person, that developer, as we dig in, is understanding our tools and the tools that we can leverage. So one of those tools, Visual Studio Code, you might have seen it, and also just leveraging some of the built-in features. Leveraging, I said leveraging 3 times, so that must means it's true, right? I say least privilege 3 times, it means it's true. So
It's true.
jumping into that. So the Amazon Q developer, right? See, it's true. Jen said it, quoted 2025 on the 10th of February. So if we go to Twitter and say, okay, what, uh, let's say AI data protection tools should I use in AWS? I just want to answer this question. This is an important part of the equation that we're trying to get. Well, Macy popped up. That is interesting, right? Documentation, correlation, encryption, and key management, and then some sample code pieces. So this is me just coming in as an individual, not knowing anything. I went to the documentation, figured out some of the words and how they were spelt, and then coming into developer. Then I was able to start to think about the different code pieces. And what's interesting, I would say, with this is when you start to delve into the different coding mechanisms, like, okay, I want to create identity roles, I want to create some Python code, things of that nature. That's kind of where this comes into play. And we won't stay here too long, because I know it's still around the brunch time in the East Coast time zone, right? So people are still probably eating lunch. But what you want to do is just think about the different ways that you can leverage tools like developer when you're thinking about data protection, because it's all simple. All you have to do is just say, hey, what is next? What do I have to define? And can you create an example secure endpoint? And then start to delve in from there. So if you haven't used the developer in Visual Studio Code, those combinations, I think very important part of the puzzle. So as we start to go down that road as a level 1 adventurer, we also start to think about what other resources, what other things should we start to look at. And if you're more like, hey, I'm hands on, but I need some guardrails, I need a little bit of something else to help me around, I think workshops are a very good place to start off, right, Jen? Is you get a workshop, it's like a guided tour. It's like when you go into a theme park. It's like, all right, I know this is a haunted mansion. I'm going to be scared in the beginning. Halfway through, I'm going to be scared. And at the end, I'm going to be scared and hungry. So what we will do is look at maybe something that has to do with generative AI with, hey, SageMaker. So if we take a look at that specific workshop that is available, then we can start to think about, hey, this is a little bit of that guided tour. And now, if you haven't worked with SageMaker, this is a perfect opportunity. This is the way that we can get to the place of, hey, what are some models? What is image generation? What is llama? Those words that we spoke about, all very important parts. But I'll skip ahead. I'll use the fast forward button and get to a point where, hey, what we'll do is, hey, prompt engineering. What are the types of prompts? 0 shot, 1 shot, chain of thought. So I'd be interested in the chat. Have you worked with prompt engineering before, just as a whole? And here's the definition if you need a little bit more. But essentially, you're able to craft things in a certain way. And this is important because what did we talk about earlier? If we rewind, the OWASP top 10, yeah, it's a big part. Another part of the puzzle when it comes to resources and side quests and takeaways, that's the important thing, is we want you to take away something. Right? It's almost like a birthday party. You want to take away, some cake and some things. Every week, we want you to take away some knowledge and go on a little side quest on your own. We set up the foundations, but we want to really hear from you as you go through these workshops, as you go through something like a skill builder, signing up for these different items. Right? And I don't know, Jen, I don't know about you, but I like to go on little side quests with skill builders and workshops and things of that nature, right?
Oh my gosh, yes. That is honestly, I would say, my number one takeaway. If you learn nothing from this session here, is get hands on keyboard and play around. That is the best way, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people. I've heard this from a lot of people. It just kind of sticks better, right? We can talk here about enabling model invocation logging for Bedrock, or we can talk about Macy and categorizing your data. But if you're not going in there and really seeing what that looks like, and the specific configuration and the extent of those features and the capabilities, it's just kind of, like, okay, understanding the theory is great and all, but really getting in there, and these, you have an environment where you can spin up all these resources. How often do you get that opportunity where you can just go and have your playground here and just follow along the prompts and build something? It's
Yeah,
awesome.
exactly. And what I would say is make sure you put some metrics for when you spin up those items, right?
Oh
Because
yeah.
the frugality standpoint sometimes, right, is it's like, hey, well, let's play around with everything. But when you get that alert, shut everything down. Grand opening, grand closing. But it's great to have those hands-on keyboard moments where you're just like figuring things out. I think that's the main takeaway that we always like to build. You know, with our show, what we're trying to do is look at these little nuances and look at all these different paths you could go down. And that's kind of the point of what we're trying to do. Break things down to the ones and zeros. I think that was 3 times. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the other place that if you want a casual jaunt into the world of security, into the world of just AWS and reading, one place I would suggest is going and grabbing yourself one article, one blog of the AWS variety. I usually refer to them as the articles of the day, as pieces of documentation that you grab after, your 5 a.m. run. You do, grab the beverage of your choice, coffee, tea, water, or other, and you sit down. You have your oatmeal, right, Jen? And then you start to say, hey, what else can I read? What can I delve into? And one of those blogs, I would say, that we have today is implement effective data authorization mechanisms to secure your data using generative AI applications. I can say that one time and one time only, part one. So it's always a mouthful sometimes when you say the blog names. But this is a 2-series blog. And I think this is another resource that you can go down and start to think about, like, hey, what does data security mean to me? And how, if I zoom in a bit, you can start to go down the path of understanding what these different mechanisms are. And one of the different ways is figuring out the risks, as we spoke about, the services, as we spoke about. Hey, and stay, like, how does this work? Right? That's a big thing. Is like the mysterious part is just breaking it down exactly to this. And this blog helps you to go down the path of that. So starting to understand that, very important part. And if you're new to security, new to generative AI, take each one of these pieces and go down the route of just exploring. I think that's a very important part. So this is the takeaway homework assignment for everybody. This is the side quest. You pull off the bulletin board and say, hey, I accept this quest. And what we can do as well, as we start to run low on time, is get to the point of what did we talk about here today? I have my thoughts. What are your closing thoughts, I would say, Jen, on what did we cover today?
I would say, if you are building a generative AI application, that although this may be, new services that you're using, new concepts, a lot of the things, a lot of the fundamentals still remain the same. And I think that is so important to really, hone in on, because, you know, it's like, oh, like the new thing is generative AI, and we got to get on it, and all these things, and we're going to be behind. It's a lot of the security controls and even the architecture, right? Yeah, there's new services that are definitely out there, but the fundamentals are always there. So if you're a security professional like myself, I think that's comforting. And
Yeah.
the fact that there's just an abundance of resources, skill builder, blogs, all of the things that we've talked about here is just kind of going to help you equip you with all the information you need and all the hands-on experience that you need. So yeah, don't fret.
Yes, exactly. And I concur, I would say, with that is there's a lot of different things, but going down the path of just exploring, understanding, and just being curious, I think is a big part of that equation. And
Mhm.
I think that's, if we were to take away some homework, is exploring what some of those AI data protection items that we discussed are. How do I leverage Macy?
Yep.
Figure it out, right? By jumping into it and just playing around with these different aspects and going down the documentation
Yeah.
and starting to think about, hey, you mentioned a very important part is, hey, how do we adjust to this new thing? Well, if security is top priority and the first thing, you already adjusted. You just have to tinker a little bit. And that's kind of where we're coming from.
Yeah.
So, with that being said, I think we're almost out of time. So, what I wanted to do is thank everybody for coming today and staying with us along this ride and talk about breakfast food and data protection and Macy and all these different things. I think it's important. Wouldn't you agree, Jen?
Right?
Right?
Absolutely.
Yep. So we had some fun, and I appreciate all the comments and the people putting in the chats, things of that nature. So if you like this, tune in next week, same time, same place, and same thing about security. The title is "It's Dangerous to Go Alone." So take this: tools for data security. It's going to be a fun one, especially if you get that reference. 10 billion points to you. So 2/17/25, 2 p.m. Eastern. And we will see you on the next one. So until then, we will say bye and have fun. Keep on side questing and keep on securing.
Bye.